Welcome to the TCJ podcast, where we discuss curious, thought-provoking, and sometimes controversial ideas through the lens of biblical wisdom. I'm your host, Keith Wood. Today I'm joined by Brian Maggard. Brian is the Dean of Men here at Trinity Baptist College. Brian also has a Master's of Divinity, and he's finishing up a PhD in biblical archaeology. And so we're going to be discussing the topic of how should Christians think about archaeology. Brian, thank you so much for being here.
Hey, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So as we get into this topic of biblical archaeology, could you describe for us briefly some of the archaeological work that you've done and what significance you see in that work?
So all of my work in biblical archaeology has been done on the Jordan side of the Levant, which is across the river from Israel. And we are at a site called Tel El Hammam, which is the in Arabic, Tel means ruin, and Hammam means baths. So it's ruin of the baths. So it is an archaeological site that sits across the valley, the Jordan Valley, at the north end of the Dead Sea, which is about 8 miles as the crow flies from Jericho. So we can stand on our site and look at the biblical city of Jericho, and on a clear day, if they're not burning tires in the valley, we can see all the way to the Cisjordan highlands and Jerusalem on a very good day. So we are directly north and a little bit south, or I'm sorry, north and a little bit west of Pisgah, which is biblical Mount Nebo. So standing at Mount Nebo, you can look and see our site clear as day. It's just about a kilometer or two walk down a few wadis and you're there. So it is a continuously occupied Chalcolithic city that has the palace complex, or the top or upper tell, the upper ruin, is about the size of the White House. And whatever was there, it was a pretty profound and important city in the Bronze Age. So this ties into the biblical narrative of both Abraham and Moses. So both of them are going to be coming through this region. And if Moses is standing at the top of, picks up Mount Nebo, which the traditional site associated with Mount Nebo, it's the only mountain nearby. It has to be that spot. It can't be anywhere else. If that's the traditional site where Moses stood and looked out, it's a very historically significant site for biblical scholars. So Dr. Stephen Collins has been excavating there for about 16 dig seasons and believes that that site is associated with what we know as biblical Sodom.
Okay, wow. That's pretty fascinating.
That's a
Very
mouthful,
interesting. Yeah. Okay, and so you've done numerous digs there. How much time have you spent actually working on that site?
About close to 6 months overall dig time at Tel El Hammam, and then I've been on the Israeli side a few times as well. The fascinating thing about historical geography and the Bible, and the biblical writers did not come up with imaginary geographical locations. It's not like you're going to find Middle Earth mentioned in the scriptures. You're not going to find the 100-acre wood. You're not going to be looking for Narnia. Every place the Bible tells you to go, you go, and there is a city there. Now, the biblical or the historical figures that were there didn't always name it, and if they did, they didn't name it the same thing that we call it today. So you never find, or you rarely find, a street sign that says "Welcome to Jerusalem." It just doesn't happen. There was one time in Akron, where there was a plaque that said "Dedication to the gods of Akron." So it does happen, but it's not very common. So usually you have to take geological markers and historical clues that will lead you to the correct site. But it's not really a mystery where these places are. Tel El Hammam is such a continuously occupied city, and it's been around for such a long time. If it's not biblical Sodom, then the biblical community, the biblical scholars, need to address what it is, because it's a massive city.
Yeah.
So there's no getting around that.
It needs to be
big,
accounted for one way or the other.
whatever it is. So the controversy, every time you mention biblical Sodom and you scroll through Google, or you look at things on YouTube, you'll see all kinds of we kind of call them false friends. The people who are trying to help, but really they're pointing a lot of people in the wrong direction. The father of modern archaeology is a man named William F. Albright. He was traditionally regarded as the one who kind of invented biblical archaeology, and his work even today still stands. And there are still scholars today who hold to the Albrightian school, like Bill Deaver. I don't know if we would call him a friend per se, but he does call himself a biblical archaeologist. So his influence is overwhelming. And he said, well, I don't know, but it's probably at the south end of the Dead Sea. The trouble is, if you go to the south end of the Dead Sea and you look around, it's basically a wasteland. There's a pretty good sized site down there called Baba Dra, and a lot of people have put Sodom down there at the south end of the Dead Sea. The trouble is, Baba Dra was never occupied. It was destroyed around 2500 BC. So even the most liberal of the date setters for the date of Sodom, that would be the destruction layer would be way too early for that to be a contender, a serious contender. Here's the thing. Again, the geography, follow the text. If you look at Genesis 13, 1 through 12, where does it say the city of Sodom was? Abraham goes, and remember, he and Lot they're having issues with their families and their tribes or their clan or whatever. And Lot, knowing that Abraham was already promised the Cisjordan, goes the other way. So the only other way he can go is toward Pisgah, or toward what we call the plain of the Jordan Valley. And the author, by the way, had to know about Egypt, because he says the land is watered like the land of the Nile Valley.
Oh, interesting.
So he had to know. So the author can't be an exile in Assyria or in the later periods. It has to be someone who's familiar with Egypt who's writing this.
Yeah,
so
that's fascinating.
a good clue that Moses, certainly authored the first 5 books of the Bible, which we affirm. And if that's the case, the geography would lead you necessarily to conclude that the well-watered plain of the Jordan, they call it a kikar. Here in the States, we call it a tortilla or a pita bread. The kikar, they still have kikar, which is a round disc, either a disc of metal to be like a talent of money, or like a bread, talent of a loaf of bread. So it's this round 8-kilometer square section of well-watered grassland that's feeding into the Dead Sea from the Jordan Valley. They have alluvial floods that happen every year, and with these alluvial floods comes this beautiful black soil, just like the Nile, and they can grow their barley and all their grains and produce all the necessary food. And you can see through its occupation, there's always store cities where people are storing grain. So we find a lot of burned, charred barley. We find a lot of grain that they were housing at this site, because whatever it was, they were doing a lot of agricultural farming at the time. So now, tying that to Sodom, one of the other things you need, as well as geography, so if Abraham is in Genesis 13, if Abraham is standing at Bethel and Ai and he looks across the valley, you can see Pisgah from where he's standing. You cannot see the south end of the Dead Sea. It's impossible for the destruction to be viewed by Abraham at that particular site. I'm sorry, I'm kind of running around here, but
it's okay. It's fascinating.
Yeah, so he's looking across the valley. Lot goes down into the Jordan Valley there and settles in this massive city. And then the Bible says something happened at the site. The site was destroyed. And in the biblical text, it's goprit, which means fire and stone from heaven. Now, again, maybe it's a coincidence, but we have a destruction matrix at our site that takes off. In my opinion, it completely confirms the biblical narrative of the story of Sodom. What we have is a destruction. Here's what scientists have told us. Right around 1700 BC, you have a massive above-ground airburst that took out the entire northern region of the Dead Sea. Every single city in that region, including Jericho, went down for over 400 years, just as the biblical text says. So whatever happened, every single city in that region went offline at the same time by a massive event, and we believe that it was an above-ground meteoric airburst. And it was just published in the Nature Scientific Reports magazine, and it's been one of the most downloaded articles that they've ever had. So you can go online and look up Tel El Hammam, Journal of Nature, and you can read the article for yourself and decide if you think it sounds like what could have happened there. We have femurs that have been completely sheared off by fire. We have mud brick that has been burned so severely on the surface that it's turned almost to a glass or a glaze.
Wow.
We have pieces of pottery that when they first examined them, they said this looks like trinitite. So if you remember your history, and the college is located in New Mexico, so New Mexico is associated with the first atomic blast. And the site they call the Trinity site, and they find these glass, they call them clinkers, and these glass pieces of sand that's fused together, they call it trinitite. Well, we have something very similar at our site with pottery that has boiled on one side and the other side is still fired. It's profound. So whatever took down the site, it was a big explosion. And it happened right around the same time period, given what's 200 years among biblical friends, right? So depending on here's the trouble. You ask 3 different Egyptologists to give you a definitive date, and they'll all vary between 200 and 300 years. So they simply didn't scientifically examine the world in the same manner that we did. So they're much more loose with their dating and things like that. Now, there are hard dates that we can get based on solar eclipses and events that take place that we can hard date a lot of things, but for the most part, they're fairly loose when it comes to actually dating locations and regions.
Well, I think that this is so great and helpful because I think that it gives a lot of insight into, okay, you go out to this place, what kind of reasoning goes into actually determining an answer to a question like this? And I think that you've given us a really good glimpse into that kind of question. Maybe one last question on Sodom, and then we'll get maybe a little more philosophical about archaeology broadly. So I'm going to ask you to put just a numerical value. Tel El Hammam, how likely do you think it is that it is actually the Sodom of the Bible?
When you stand on the site and you look across the valley at Jericho, and then you see up there on a clear day, like I said, you can look all the way at Jerusalem. It fits. Again, the Bible is so accurate in the way that it records details. It's not interested in being a scientific textbook. We all know that, right? However, it doesn't give false information. It always tells the truth. If this city is not Sodom, then I think the archaeological community has to come up with what the site actually is, because there are 14 ruins or tells around this primary site that we've excavated at Tel El Hammam. Those sites all show the same kind of destruction matrix that we have at ours. They all show that Sodom was the big kid on the block, just like the Bible says Sodom, Gomorrah, Zeboim and Abna. All of these sites, they're all right in the same vicinity. It fits. If you go down to the south end of the Dead Sea, You have Babadra, you have FIFA, and you have a couple other sites. Some people put Numera down there. Maybe that's true, but it's the wrong destruction. The matrix, the destruction matrix indicates that it was destroyed by probably by fire set by raiders.
Okay.
Babadra is, for the most part, it's a dry, desolate, acacia tree laden dirt valley. There's nothing there. Now they have piped in water, but it's basically a nomadic cemetery down there. You go down there in Babadra, and there's just a massive cemetery where nomads have been burying ancestors for generations. There's not much else there. Now, I know that people also say, well, Sodom, it's probably at the south end of the Dead Sea, and it's just covered over by the water. Well, let me tell you something. To build your city in a floodplain on the bottom of a lake bed, the ancient people were not stupid. When they built on top of a mound or a place where they could get good soil, where they could farm. It was defendable, where they could hold off invaders, and it was high enough up to where the king wouldn't have to smell the cooking fires of all of the people in the city. So they would never build a city at the extreme south end of the Dead Sea, 1,428 meters below sea level, in the middle of the rift, when they know as well as we do that the annual rainfall produces at varying rates, causing the city to be destroyed at the at the south end of the Dead Sea. It's just it doesn't make any sense. So if you're going to put this Sodom site at the south end of the Dead Sea, you need another site. It's not Babadra. Babadra is a desolate wasteland. It's got to be the north end of the Dead Sea. There's so much agricultural opportunity there, and a huge, well-watered plain, just like the writer of the Torah said.
So you didn't give me a number, but it sounds like it would be a pretty high number.
I would. I am confident that I don't know if you want an actual number. I'd say 95% certainty.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah. It's a magnificent site. It would be incredible to go and take a tour and show you.
It sounds
around.
like it.
It's just,
that's very cool.
When standing at Mount Nebo, looking out over the plain, the whole thing fits together. The historical geography doesn't lie.
Yeah.
Where do the Bible writers tell us to look? You cannot see Babadra from Bethel and Ai. It's not possible. You can see the north end. Sorry.
No,
you can't see the north end, but you can't see the south end. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, I love just talking to you about this because it's so evident that being there and being involved in these digs and comparing it to what the Bible says has been so impactful for you. Yeah. And so I wanted to ask you what got you into this to begin with, and what prompted your interest in archaeology.
Yeah. So for me, attending school and taking Old Testament classes and listening to these skeptics and hearing people talking, how do you set out to prove that one man existed? How do you say, well, there's no physical evidence that ties Moses, or, well, I would say more importantly, that ties Abraham to any physical location. How could you possibly conclude that that's telling you a true story? How do you know that what the writers are telling you is actually true? Why isn't the documentary hypothesis, or the idea that the first 5 books of the Bible are written by later Judaite high priests who want to create this kind of overwhelming cultural relevance to a people who are in exile? They want to encourage them with these stories that tell of their beginnings, but they're not actually telling you a true narrative, because they're talking much later and they have no idea what they're talking about, and all of these things are myths and they're all kind of tied together. Nobody was there at creation. How did Moses get all so what do you do with that? Apologetically, for a Christian, how do you say, well, you know what, I affirm that Moses wrote the Torah, and then all of these things come into play. Well, do you believe in a worldwide flood? Do you believe in the creation account? Do you hold to a 6-day literal creation? How do you answer all these questions? I didn't know. At the end of my education, I had no idea. So for me, it was I was a believer, and I believe I was converted, and I believe that I was possessed by the Holy Spirit, and as a believer, I wanted to know, how I didn't even really know how to put it into words, but how do you prove the Bible is true? That's not the right terminology, but I didn't know that. Mm-hmm. So how do you say, well, Moses was a real person, Abraham was a real person, Isaac, Jacob, all these people, they are real people who lived real lives. And for me, archaeology was an avenue into discovering the world of the patriarchs.
Okay, so you were faced with a lot of these skeptical challenges about the Bible, about the biblical characters, and you said, let me actually do some of the research for myself and see what actually turns up.
Right.
So with that being said, how has the study of archaeology impacted your confidence in Christianity now as you look back on it?
Well, I'm so glad you asked. Well, so for me, learning to appreciate the world of the Bible, as I said earlier, the Bible gives historical geography as fact, never imaginary cities that take you places that you end up with no idea where you go. Here's the thing: when people say, "Well, how does the Bible compare with the historical record?" And the question you have to ask back is, what historical record? Because the Bible is really the only one. There are pieces. We do have evidences of civilizations, but as far as writing down a history in the same way as the biblical writers, it doesn't exist. There's no such thing as a historical record that we have to compare the text to. Mm-hmm. Now, what we do have is we have the Bible following, after Genesis 11, we have the Bible following one man who becomes one nation. And there's a purpose for that and a reason for that. He begins with an understanding of man's fallen nature and sets about a course of action that will change that in the person and work of Jesus Christ, who is of the line of Abraham. And that all starts in Genesis 12. So if you don't hold to a literal Genesis, you are going to have trouble with the entire biblical narrative, because it all ties together. And what do you do with Jesus Christ, who said and affirmed that Moses wrote these things? So is the text right? Do we have the correct information from Jesus, who we believe to be God himself in human form, or who in the form took the form of a human being, having both the nature of God and the nature of man? Do we hold these things he said to be true? Because if not, then we're going to run into trouble. And that was the thing that I was wrestling with. How do we get around the idea that, well, maybe Abraham isn't a historical figure, maybe Adam isn't a historical figure, but here's the problem. There is no other narrative that tells a story in any way like the Bible story itself. It is the only story that actually makes sense of the world the way it is. It never speaks in crazy terms. In fact, when you talk about the resurrection, Paul says to you, look, you can go ask the witnesses. You can go see the people who witnessed him rise from the dead. You don't have to believe me. There's 500 people that are still alive. You can go talk to them. This is his defense. Here, this is the gospel, that Jesus Christ died, that he was raised, that he was buried, that he was raised again, and all of these people saw him. So the Bible is an evidential approach to understanding your faith. Jesus says to Thomas, Thomas, come here, put your fingers in my side and believe. Right? So we examine the evidence in order to see how it comports with reality. And in that, we can strengthen our faith and deepen our appreciation for the biblical text, knowing that when it speaks of historical events, it speaks truthfully. And it does. Everything that the Bible tells you is coherent and contextual with the world that it exists at the time. So Abraham is a product of the Middle Bronze Age. He belongs to the Akkadian civilization. He was brought out of the land of Ur, and he fights with Kedorlaomer, and even the names of these 5 kings that came over and fought with him are all names that you would find in that region of the world. Everything fits with the biblical narrative. Every time you put spade to earth, you unearth evidence that shows the Bible is a completely accurate historical text.
Wow. That's so fascinating. I think it's so cool what you said about the historical record, right? I think sometimes we just envision that there's like this book of like the history of the world and this is how things were and we can compare the Bible against it. But really what you're saying is, well, if anything's telling a story about the ancient world, it's the Bible, right? We can go and we can find fragments of this or, you know, a piece of a pot or something like that, you know, but
I mean, even inflation, when it's talking about the slave price of Joseph being sold into slavery, it's identical with what the record is telling us. We have a papyrus called the Brooklyn Papyrus that says that the average slave price was exactly the price that the Midianites would have paid for Joseph when they purchased him from his brothers. I mean, the detail, the small details, right? One of my favorite stories is everybody said, well, Pilate never existed, obviously. That's ridiculous. Who believes Pilate was a real person? Well, they're digging at Caesarea Maritima and they find this 3-foot block of concrete and it says Pontius Pilate dedicates this arena to Tiberius. You know, every time in the Hittite library, nobody believes the Hittites were real people. That's absurd. Don't be ridiculous. And they uncover the entire Hittite library and find all the records of the correspondence between them and the 18th dynasty of Egypt. And they find evidence of all of these multiple people that are existing all over the place. The Amorites are in there. The Hittites are in there. You know, and that ties to the story of Abraham and it ties to the story of David. And, you know, all of these things, when you examine the evidence, all of these things add up to the biblical account is the most accurate, the most pristine. It's perfect.
There's just, I mean, just hearing you rattle all these things off, there's so much that it's really overwhelming. What is one archaeological fact that you think it would benefit your average Christian to know, or just something that you think, you know, your average Christian ought to be aware of?
Well, I think probably the most important archaeological discovery of I would say just about probably the most important archaeological discovery of all time is the Dead Sea Scrolls. Mm-hmm. The Dead Sea Scrolls, here's the problem. So the Dead Sea, let me just explain it. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the story goes in 1947, a Bedouin sheep herder threw a rock into a cave and heard the sound of glass breaking. So he got a rope and climbed into these caves and found these jars, and inside these jars are hundreds and hundreds, and later we realized thousands and thousands of scrolls, and they're preserved and given to us by a group of people that we now know as the Essenes, or the Essenes, that lived outside of or on the fringes of society, that believed in an apocalyptic, messianic return, imminent return, about 40 years before Jesus came, strangely enough. And from this belief or this idea, they separated from society and tried to purify themselves. So we found at the Essene community hundreds and hundreds of mikvaot that are ceremonial or traditional traditional Hebrew baths for ceremonial purification. And they recorded all of these Old Testament scrolls. And from these Old Testament scrolls, some of them have been dated to 300 years before the life of Christ. So we have, and the most often recorded scroll is Isaiah, Deuteronomy, Genesis, Psalms, Song of Solomon, and I think there's a couple others. We have complete, absolutely pristine, complete copies of every single Old Testament canonical book except Esther, which makes sense.
Wow.
Because it's so recent. It makes sense. So, and multiple copies. So Isaiah 53, think about the implications of Isaiah 53 and the suffering servant, the last servant song, the four servant songs leading up to this magnum opus of the servant who comes as a substitute for humanity and for Israel. In Isaiah 52, that is all documented to be written at least 300 years before Christ came on the scene. These scrolls that are in our actual possession.
Yeah.
Now, what that does historically is it takes the Masoretic texts. We don't have time to get into that, but it takes the Masoretic texts that we have at our disposal. It takes those texts and then moves them back 1,100 years earlier. So we have pre-Jesus Christ scrolls of every book of the Old Testament. So what it does is it immediately confirms the Old Testament that was available for the Jews that lived at the time of Christ, that it was absolutely correct. And we find parallel between the texts that we have and the texts that were available at the time. We find 98% accuracy with the text. So they are copying the text that we had, and it's exactly accurate with the texts that were found in the ground. Now that is miraculous.
Yeah. So when you hear Jesus or Paul talking about this is what Moses and the prophets said, these are what the scriptures said, we know exactly what they're talking about.
We know for a fact they had an accurate, we have an accurate Bible.
Wow.
Yeah, it's incredible.
That is really cool.
Yeah. Now for New Testament stuff, the only book I'd recommend on that, a really good book, is Michael Kruger's work called Canon Revisited, which he goes into the reasons why we hold to a New Testament canon, and it's different than why we hold to an Old Testament canon. So,
okay. Cool. Yeah. Well, maybe we'll have to have you on for a second episode, and we can talk about some of that stuff. Are there any archaeological facts that you have wrestled with, or maybe currently wrestling with?
Well, I think the only issue that for me, I've kind of put it to bed, is the documentary hypothesis. Wellhausen's. If you look at, Frederick Bauer and his theory that, what they did, don't be ridiculous. What they did, there were a whole bunch of different views after Christ, came. There's all these different views out there, and we can't say for certain what really happened. So probably what happened is you had all these weird views and weird beliefs, and then from all these weird beliefs, they were kind of codified at the Council of Nicaea, and Constantine kind of iron-fistedly put his hand down and said, this I decree, these works are going to be included, and those works are not. Well, what you're actually describing is Islam, not Christianity, because that is not what happened. So we have archaeological evidence that proves that they believed that Jesus Christ was God. There's an inscription called the Megiddo inscription that says Jesus Christ Theanustos, or there's all these archaeological evidences that are way before the Council of Nicaea that hold that there's no way you could have a bunch of disparate ideas all coalesce into one belief and then from there go forward. What it was is they had a consistent approach to understanding the scriptures and understood them at the time, and we know this from internal sources in the text, both Peter and Paul, saying that each other were writing scripture. So they knew what they were doing was different than, say, Clement, who wrote in the 2nd century. He has absolute certainty that what he is writing is not scripture. So the Didache and all these good works that are completed in the 1st and 2nd centuries, they're not included, even though they're excellent in third Corinthians by Clement. They're not included because they knew that they were not writing sacred scripture. So, and archaeology confirms all of that. You can tie all that together. Another good one, a lot of people say, well, it's not possible that David was a real person. It's ridiculous. He was probably a chieftain with maybe 300 guys, and he ran around and did some things, and it's ridiculous that he was. Well, they find up in a place called Dan, they find a block of a stela there that says, "From an enemy, Riza, of Damascus, I came and I conquered the house of David." Well, apparently by that time, 10th generation, or 10th century, 9th century, 8th century, 7th century, and on into that period, you're getting the records that they have are all being handed down, so that the line of David is, even in the 7th century, is still a prominent line that was widely known and recognized. So for someone to say that it's preposterous, they're simply not looking at fact.
And that discovery, my wife actually loves talking about that.
Yeah.
She read about
Stealer,
it. Yeah.
In fact, it's very early, 93, I think, 94, 93, something like that, I think.
I was going to say, that's a pretty recent discovery, right?
Very early.
And even the Dead Sea Scrolls are mid-1900s.
1947.
Yeah,
and not even really translated until the 60s and 70s, and even into the 80s, because there were so many problems with, every time you go over there, it's like the United Nations. So you're always running around with, who has what, and the Catholics have their piece, and the Protestants have theirs, and whoever's got the money has the other part. And then there's the Jewish interests that are paying big bucks for all this stuff. So it's always this.
There's a political game that's going on there.
Always,
as well.
yeah. So they didn't even get published until much later. So yeah, your point is those are all very recent.
Yeah. So there's live work going on in these areas. We are still learning stuff all the time. I mean, it is fascinating to think that even up until the 1990s, there was so much dispute about whether David was a seriously, a serious historical figure.
Can you imagine being a Christian around the 1880s, and Darwin has written, his magnum opus, and you're trying to maintain your fidelity or fealty to the text, and everybody's telling you it's not true.
Yeah.
I mean, it must have been. I admire those folks. Our forefathers, their steadfastness is a witness to us all.
Yeah. Wow. Well, as we round out, what advice would you give to a Christian who's listening to this and who wants to explore archaeology more deeply? Are there any maybe resources that you could recommend to get them started, or maybe common pitfalls to watch out for as they embark on that?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for that. I think archaeology, biblical archaeology, has done a great disservice by false friends who are trying to help but are not skilled archaeologists, or are either that or they have an agenda. So I have an agenda. As a Bible-believing Christian, I want you to come to saving faith in Jesus Christ. That is my first and foremost goal. But I believe that I lead with that. Whereas I think some people, want to undermine Christianity, and they don't really tell you their objective. So it's important to bear in mind that a lot of here's the thing, we all share the same facts, but from these facts, we can come to different conclusions. But I think the Bible is a magnificent, accurate, detailed account of what actually took place. And we can have faith in the knowledge that what it's saying is true. So you'll hear stories. Well, we found biblical Sodom, and they take you down to the south end of the Dead Sea, and they show you rock formations that, if you squint and look at it in the sunlight, it looks like a person. And they say, see? Well, no, not really, because rock formations can, we can be fooled by zoomorphic representations all over. It doesn't necessarily mean anything.
Yeah.
What does the text actually say? What does the evidence say? And where does it lead you? These are the things that we have to come to terms with. I think another problem that we have is we end up fighting a whole lot over the age of the earth, the route of biblical exodus is a huge deal, and people camp out on these things. I think Hoffmeyer is a man that I love very much. I respect him, Harry Hoffmeyer. He wrote a book called Exploring the Exodus Routes, or Israel in Sinai, or something like that. Anyway, Hoffmeyer, he gives you, various, he's a archaeologist, excavated at Tel Borg, and did some work at Amarna, I think, as well. And his work, he's very clear-eyed, and he's one of us. He's a Bible-believing scholar. And you just have to be careful of your sources, because so many of them are not telling you their motivation. And I think that's critical for Christians to be aware of. You need to examine somebody's underlying worldview, because with that comes a way to slant the historical narrative to your liking. And we just need to be aware of that. Not everybody has pure motives. I know it's a big surprise.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think there's a couple of things that I'm hearing there. I think the first one I heard was probably some intellectual integrity, right? You don't have to go and make evidence fit the story that you think the Bible's telling, right? Like, the Bible tells a true story, and if the evidence is there, then that's great. Exactly. You don't need to make it appear.
No.
Probably also some humility, right? As you're examining some of these things, being willing to say, maybe I didn't have the right story. And then also recognizing that, not everybody is practicing those virtues, right? So as I'm investigating what other people have said, recognize that they might have an agenda there.
That's right.
Brian, thank you so much for this conversation. I've had a great time. I hope that our listeners have too.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, this is great. We'll probably have to have you again sometime and do more of this. But until then, thank you very much.